I've always been passionate about wildlife. Hunting in Alaska was an old dream, a way to test my limits and experience nature in its purest and most relentless state. My name is John, and I've been through various extreme situations, but nothing compared to what I experienced that season. I set out alone with my backpack full of supplies and a reliable rifle. The first few days were peaceful. I managed to capture some small animals and camp in safe places. However, the weather in Alaska is unpredictable. One morning, a snowstorm formed on the horizon, advancing with frightening speed. The sky darkened, and the snow began to fall intensely, making visibility almost nil. I tried to return to my camp, but the snow had already covered the path. The cold was piercing, and my body began to feel the effects of hypothermia. I walked for hours, desperately searching for shelter, until I saw a cabin in the distance. It was an old, seemingly abandoned structure, but it was my only hope. The door creaked open, revealing a dark and damp interior. The cabin had a fireplace, an old bed, and some dusty furniture. I lit the fireplace with difficulty, but the heat soon began to warm me. The feeling of relief, however, was quickly replaced by an inexplicable discomfort. The solitude and isolation seemed to amplify every sound, every shadow. On the second night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps upstairs. My heart raced. The cabin was small, and I was sure I was alone. I grabbed my flashlight and my gun, carefully going up the stairs. The upstairs was empty, but the feeling of being watched persisted. As the days passed, the supernatural events intensified. Doors slammed by themselves, whispers echoed through the halls, and objects moved around. I began to doubt my sanity. The human mind can play tricks, especially under extreme stress and isolation. One night, looking out the window, I saw an enigmatic figure outside. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, and staring at me intently. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the figure seemed so real. I decided I needed to leave as soon as possible, but the storm seemed endless. The cabin had become a prison, and the fear grew every day. The figure started appearing inside the cabin, always at a distance, but getting closer each time. I knew it wasn't real, but my mind was playing tricks, and the solitude amplified the terror. On the 8th day, I woke up with the figure standing beside my bed. Its face was hidden by the cloak, but I could feel its eyes on me. Fear paralyzed me, and when I tried to move, the figure disappeared. I decided I could no longer wait. I grabbed my things and ventured out into the storm, determined to find a way back, even if it meant facing the deadly cold. I walked for hours in the deep snow, directionless, just trying to get away from that cursed cabin. The figure followed me, always at a distance, but I could feel its presence. The cold was unbearable. My limbs began to numb, and exhaustion took over. When I could no longer walk, I collapsed in the snow. My vision began to darken, and the last thing I saw was the figure approaching, reaching out to me. The cold touch on my face was the last sensation I had before losing consciousness. I woke up in a hospital, rescued by a search team who found me nearly frozen. I survived, but I could never forget the eyes of that figure. I never returned to Alaska, and winter nights still bring nightmares of that cabin and the presence I found there. I know loneliness can play tricks on the mind, but that experience taught me that there's something beyond human comprehension, something lurking in the shadows that solitude only intensifies. The psychological terror I endured in that Alaskan cabin scarred my soul in a way I'll never forget. The figure still visits me in dreams, and the cold touch on my face is a constant reminder that some horrors are real, even if our minds try to convince us otherwise. Every time I try to tell my story, I feel that words aren't enough to convey the terror I lived through. People look at me with skepticism, as if it were just another exaggerated horror tale. But for me, the reality of that experience is unquestionable. I decided to record every detail, hoping that others might understand and perhaps avoid the same fate. On that particular night, the temperature dropped even further, and the storm reached its peak. The winds howled, as if nature itself was in agony. The fireplace seemed insufficient to warm the cabin, and the cold fear in my chest only grew. The figure appeared more frequently, always at the edge of my vision, never fully visible but always present. I began to investigate the cabin's history, hoping to find some explanation for the events happening. I searched through drawers, looking for any clue that could help me understand what was going on. I found an old diary, its pages yellowed and fragile with age. The entries were disturbing, describing experiences similar to mine from a previous occupant who apparently succumbed to the terror. The diary's accounts became increasingly desperate. The last entry was almost illegible, written in haste, describing the figure as an entity that fed on fear and solitude. The final sentence was a plea for help, followed by a smear that looked like blood. The diary fell from my hands, and I felt I was facing something far beyond my understanding. As the days went by, I began to feel I was losing control of my own mind. The figure seemed to be getting closer, its piercing gaze following me even when I closed my eyes. The nights became torment, every sound amplified, every shadow a threat. Finally, on the 10th day, the storm showed signs of subsiding. I seized the opportunity and gathered my strength for one last attempt to escape. I left the cabin facing the cold with a determination I didn't know I had. I walked for hours, each step a struggle against fatigue and exhaustion. The figure continued to follow me, a constant and oppressive presence. When I could no longer continue, I collapsed in the snow, accepting my fate. The figure approached, and for the first time I could see its face. It was a vision of pure terror, a mask of despair and anguish. Its eyes were abysses of darkness, and when it reached out to me, I felt a cold peace take over my being. I woke up days later in a hospital not knowing how I was rescued. The memories of the figure still haunt me, and each night is a battle to keep the nightmares at bay. I never returned to Alaska, and the terror of that cabin remains a scar on my soul. Loneliness and isolation can reveal horrors the human mind is not prepared to face, and sometimes reality can be scarier than any horror story. It was a quiet winter night, and I was exhausted after a long day at work. My name is Mark, and I work as a manager at a department store. That Friday had been especially tough, and all I wanted was to relax at home. My wife, Emily, and our son, James, were away visiting her parents, so I had the house all to myself. After taking a hot shower and having dinner, I decided to watch a movie. It was almost midnight when I heard a strange sound coming from the garage. I was on alert, but tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. I kept watching the movie, but the sound persisted, now more distinct. It seemed like something was moving outside. I got up from the couch and walked to the window overlooking the garage. To my surprise, the garage door was ajar. I was sure I had locked it when I got home. My heart started to race, and a sense of fear washed over me. I grabbed my phone and called the police, but the call dropped before I could talk to anyone. With no other option, I decided to investigate on my own. I took a baseball bat I kept in the closet and cautiously made my way to the garage. When I pushed the garage door open fully, I saw something that chilled my blood. A man was sitting in the driver's seat of my car, fiddling with something on the dashboard. He seemed completely unaware of my presence. "Hey, what are you doing there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting mine. There was something deeply unsettling about his gaze. He didn't look surprised or scared, just empty. "You left the door open," he replied calmly, as if his presence there was the most natural thing in the world. My whole body trembled, but I tried to keep my composure. "Get out of my car now, or I'll call the police," I threatened, raising the baseball bat. He smiled, a cold, emotionless smile, and got out of the car slowly, keeping his hands in plain sight. "You really should be more careful," he said, taking a step toward me. I instinctively backed away, keeping the bat raised. "Don't come any closer," I ordered. He stopped, still smiling. "I just wanted a place to rest," he said, his voice soft and calm. "But it seems you're not a very good host." With my heart pounding wildly, I watched as he slowly walked away from the garage and disappeared into the darkness. I ran back into the house and locked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I called the police again, and this time I managed to report the incident. The police arrived quickly, but the stranger was already gone. They searched the area but found no trace of him. They asked questions, took a report, and advised me to keep the house well locked and be alert to any suspicious activity. The night dragged on, every sound amplified by the growing fear in my chest. Finally, as dawn began to break, I managed to relax a little and fell asleep on the couch, exhausted. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of the doorbell. It was Emily and James returning home. I told them what had happened, and although Emily tried to hide it, I could see the fear in her eyes. We decided to install security cameras and improve the locks on the house. Days went by, and I tried to return to normal. However, a sense of unease lingered. Every night before going to bed, I would check all the doors and windows repeatedly. Emily and James were also more vigilant, but we tried not to let the fear take over our lives. Then, one night, I woke up to a strange sound coming from downstairs. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. My heart raced. I grabbed the baseball bat again and went downstairs, trying not to make any noise. When I reached the living room, I saw the garage door was slightly open again. Swallowing hard, I carefully opened the garage door. The stranger was there again, sitting in the driver's seat of my car, as if he had never left. This time, there was no smile on his face, just a cold, calculating expression. "I told you to be more careful," he said, not taking his eyes off me. "You didn't listen." Before I could react, he pulled out a knife and lunged at me. I tried to defend myself with the bat, but he was too quick. I felt the blade pierce my flesh, and the pain brought me to my knees. I screamed for help, but my strength was fading fast. The last thing I saw was Emily's face, pale with terror, as she found me on the floor. I heard James's screams in the background, and a feeling of guilt washed over me. I had failed to protect my family. Darkness took over, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in a hospital. Emily was by my side, tears in her eyes. "He's still out there," she said, her voice trembling. "The police couldn't catch him. We're in danger, Mark." The news was devastating. The stranger was still out there, free to find us again. Every night became a nightmare, with constant vigilance and the persistent fear that he would return to finish what he started. Our life turned into an endless cycle of terror and despair, with no hope for a happy ending. The stranger in the car had shattered our peace forever, and nothing would ever be the same. Hunting has always been a family tradition. My name is Michael, and I grew up learning the art of tracking, shooting, and surviving in the woods. In Pennsylvania, where I live, hunting season is almost sacred, a time to disconnect from daily routines and reconnect with nature. I own a vast hunting property, a refuge where I spend hours alone, seeking the peace that only nature can provide. That autumn morning, the air was crisp, and the mist still hung over the damp ground. I grabbed my rifle, donned my fluorescent orange vest as required by safety laws, and headed into the forest. I was on the lookout for deer, one of the most prized targets for hunters in the region. After a few hours without spotting anything significant, I decided to explore a more remote part of my property, where I knew wildlife was more abundant. I walked through narrow, dense trails, surrounded by the sounds of the forest. That's when I saw him for the first time. A man, seemingly carefree, walking through my property. What immediately caught my attention was the absence of the mandatory safety colors. He was wearing dark clothes, almost as if he wanted to blend in with the surroundings, which was extremely dangerous during hunting season. I decided to approach him cautiously, silently, to understand what he was doing there. "Hey, you're on private property," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative but not aggressive. The man turned slowly, and I saw his face for the first time. There was something unsettling in his eyes, a vacant, cold look that made me uncomfortable. "Sorry, I didn't know," he replied, his voice too calm for the situation. "I'm just passing through." Something about the way he spoke bothered me. Most trespassers I've encountered in the past were terrified when confronted, but this man seemed strangely calm, almost indifferent. I decided not to lower my guard. "You should know it's dangerous to be here without safety colors," I continued. "Besides, this is private property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." He smiled, a cold, emotionless smile, and took a step towards me. "I just need a place to hide for a while," he said, without explaining further. The tension rose. I didn't like the way he said, "hide." My suspicions grew, and my intuition told me something was very wrong. I gripped my rifle tighter, ready for anything. "Hide? From what?" I asked, trying to buy time and understand the situation better. "You don't want to know," he replied enigmatically. "But I can assure you, if you let me stay, no one will get hurt." The implied threat in his words made me freeze. It was evident he was planning something sinister, and I was determined not to let him proceed. "I'm going to call the police," I warned, stepping back, ready to grab my phone. Before I could make any move, he lunged at me with surprising speed. The struggle that followed was fierce and desperate. I tried to use the rifle as an improvised weapon, but he was stronger than he looked. We wrestled on the ground, rolling through the dense vegetation, and I felt the sharp pain of a blade cutting into my skin. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was his cold, impassive gaze and the sound of my own scream echoing through the forest. When I came to, I was tied to a tree, my limbs numb and the stabbing pain where he had cut me. The man was back, his eyes fixed on me as he spoke in a monotone. "You should have left me alone," he said, the blade still bloody in his hand. "Now, I have no choice." Terror gripped me. I knew he planned to finish me off, and there was no one around to help. The forest, which had always been a refuge, now became my prison. I tried to scream, but the pain and fear choked my voice. He approached slowly, and I could see the madness in his eyes. Every second felt like an eternity, and my mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to escape. But I was bound and weakened, without hope. The pain of the blade piercing my flesh again was excruciating. I closed my eyes, hoping death would come quickly, but he seemed to relish the torture, prolonging my suffering. As my life ebbed away, thoughts of Emily and James came to mind. I had failed to protect them, to return home safely. The guilt consumed me as much as the physical pain. Finally, the darkness took over and everything faded away. Days later, my body was found by other hunters, tied to that tree, a grim warning to anyone venturing into that part of the forest. The man was never found, and the story of my death became a local legend, a warning about the dangers not just of nature, but of the horrors that can lurk within the human soul. My family never fully recovered, and the terror of that day became a permanent scar in their lives. The trespasser, with his cold eyes and sinister intentions, destroyed more than just one life in that forest. He cast a shadow of fear and pain that would never be completely dispelled. Moving house is never easy, especially when you're a new driver. My name is Alex, and I just got my driver's license. My dad, Jack, and I were moving to our new home in the mountains of Pennsylvania. It was a last-minute decision, driven by a new job my dad got, and the need for a fresh start after my mother's death. Winter was in full swing, and the snow was already beginning to cover the roads as we loaded the last of our belongings into the car. "Are you ready to face this snowstorm, son?" my dad asked, with an encouraging smile. I nodded, trying to hide my nervousness. Winter roads are treacherous, and I knew we'd need to be careful. Our car was packed with boxes and furniture, making every maneuver require even more attention. We left the city at dusk, the snow falling harder by the minute. Visibility was rapidly decreasing, and the lights of the cars passing us shone like ghosts in the white fog. I drove cautiously, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. My dad was beside me, offering guidance and support. "It's going to be okay, Alex. Just stay calm and drive slow," he kept saying. After a few hours of driving, we noticed a car behind us. It was a dark vehicle, hard to identify in the storm. At first, we didn't think much of it, but as time went on, it continued to follow us closely, maintaining the same speed. The feeling of being watched began to grow. "Dad, do you think that car is following us?" I asked, trying not to sound alarmed. My dad looked in the rearview mirror and frowned. "Maybe it's just a coincidence. Keep driving, but stay alert," he replied, trying to sound calm. The road became increasingly isolated as we drove deeper into the mountains. The snow piled up, making driving more difficult, and the car behind us maintained its position. I started to feel a pang of fear, the discomfort growing inside me. Suddenly, the car behind us sped up, approaching dangerously close. The high beams blinded my rearview mirror, and I felt my heart race. "What are they doing?" I exclaimed, struggling to keep control of the car. "Stay calm, Alex. Don't let them intimidate you. Keep your focus," my dad said, tension evident in his voice. The suspicious car began signaling with its headlights, flashing repeatedly. The message was clear. They wanted us to stop. But why? Survival instinct told me to keep going. But the road was getting increasingly dangerous. The snow fell in torrents, and the wind howled around us. "Let's get off the main road and try to lose them," my dad suggested. I agreed with a nod and turned at the next exit, a narrower, more deserted road. The car continued to follow us, showing no signs of giving up. Fear was turning into panic. "Dad, what do we do now?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me with a serious expression. "We need to find a safe place to stop and ask for help. We can't keep being chased like this." After a few unbearable minutes, we spotted a small cabin by the roadside. "There, stop there," my dad said. I turned the car towards the cabin, hoping it would be a safe haven. The suspicious car slowed down, stopping at a distance, its lights still shining in the darkness. We quickly got out of the car and ran to the cabin, knocking hard on the door. An elderly man opened the door, surprised to see us. "Please help us. We're being followed," I pleaded, my voice full of desperation. The man let us in, quickly closing the door. "Calm down, you're safe here," he said, trying to reassure us. I looked out the window and saw the suspicious car still parked on the road, its lights focusing on us like predatory eyes. While inside, the man offered us coffee and a place to sit. "My name is Henry. What happened?" he asked, concerned. We told him about the chase and the attempt to force us to stop. Henry frowned, looking thoughtful. "These roads can be dangerous at night, especially with the snowstorm. They might have bad intentions," he said, glancing out the window. Time passed slowly, each minute an eternity. The suspicious car was still there, waiting. My dad and I were exhausted, but fear kept us alert. Suddenly, we heard a noise outside. Footsteps in the snow, approaching the cabin. "Henry, someone's coming," I whispered, panic rising again. He nodded, grabbing a shotgun that was hanging on the wall. "Stay behind me," he ordered, cautiously walking towards the door. The footsteps stopped, and the ensuing silence was deafening. Suddenly, the door was kicked open, and two masked men entered, armed and with threatening expressions. "What do you want?" Henry shouted, pointing the shotgun at them. One of the men laughed, a cold and lifeless sound. "We want you. Step aside and no one gets hurt," he said, his voice icy. My dad and I were paralyzed, terror rooting us in place. Henry tried to react, but the men were too quick. In an instant, he was disarmed and pushed to the ground. The men forced us to get up and leave the cabin at gunpoint. "Now get to the car," one of them ordered. We had no choice. We walked through the snow, the biting wind and fear consuming us. We reached the car, and they forced us inside. "We're going for a ride," said the man in the back seat, pointing the gun at us. My dad tried to speak, but was silenced with a blow to the head. I was in shock, unable to think or react. We drove for hours, the snowstorm growing even more intense. Finally, we arrived at an isolated area, surrounded by trees and devoid of any signs of life. "This is good," the man said, a cruel smile on his face. They forced us out of the car again. My dad was bleeding, and I was frozen with fear. "Please, don't do this," I pleaded, but they showed no mercy. "This is the end of the line for you," said the man, pointing the gun at me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. A gunshot echoed through the night, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow, a searing pain in my body. My dad was beside me, motionless. Tears streamed down my face, and the harsh reality hit me. We had fallen victim to a deadly trap, for no apparent reason. My life, which had just begun, was cut short by an act of inexplicable violence. The snowstorm continued, covering our bodies with a white shroud as the darkness of the night closed in around us. On that deserted road, our cries for help were lost in the wind, and the hope of a future dissolved in the snow. That was the last winter I would know, a victim of the evil that can hide in the shadows, waiting to strike when we least expect it. The road, the snowstorm, and the masked men remained etched in my mind as an endless nightmare, a painful reminder that safety is a fragile illusion, easily shattered by human cruelty. We were always a close-knit family. My younger brother John and I were inseparable. We grew up in a small town surrounded by forests and mountains, where we eagerly awaited the snow each winter. One of those winters, when John was 10 and I was 12, something happened that would change our lives forever. It was one of those perfect winter days. The snow was deep, and the cloudless blue sky invited us to an outdoor adventure. John and I decided to explore an area of the forest that was a bit further than we were usually allowed to go. It was a denser, less visited part, but curiosity and the desire for adventure were stronger than any fear. We had fun throwing snowballs at each other and laughing loudly. The forest, covered in a white blanket, seemed magical. At a certain point, we saw something strange partially covered by snow, a bit off the trail. It was a large black trash bag, contrasting starkly with the surrounding whiteness. We cautiously approached. John was a bit hesitant, but as the older brother, I felt I needed to be brave. When we got close, the smell hit us like a punch to the stomach. It was a nauseating odor of decaying flesh. My heart began to race as I struggled to open the bag. Inside, a horrifying sight was revealed, a body in an advanced state of decomposition, partially frozen by the snow. I immediately recognized the horror reflected in John's face, mirroring my own terror. Before we could process what we were seeing, we heard heavy, hurried footsteps approaching. Without thinking twice, I grabbed John's hand and we started running back home. Adrenaline coursed through our veins, and I could feel the presence of someone chasing us. The footsteps were fast, and the sensation of being hunted was almost unbearable. We slipped and fell several times, but the determination to escape was stronger than the pain from the falls. When we finally reached the safety of our home, we told our parents everything, and they immediately called the police. The officers arrived quickly and went with us to the spot where we had found the bag. To our despair and confusion, the trash bag and the body had disappeared. Only our footprints and marks in the snow where we had fallen and struggled to escape remained. The police didn't take us very seriously. We were treated as kids with vivid imaginations and scolded for venturing so far into the forest. No one but us seemed to believe what we had seen. The sense of helplessness and fear took over, especially when we heard heavy footsteps outside our house that same night. The following days were tormenting. John and I were afraid to leave the house, go to school, or even sleep. We felt like we were being watched, that the pursuer could come back at any moment. The nights were filled with nightmares, and we often woke up screaming. The situation began to affect our daily routine. John developed a deep fear of the dark and avoided any mention of the forest. I, on the other hand, became paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the shadowy figure hunting us. Our parents, concerned, took us to therapists, but nothing seemed to help. Months passed, and winter gave way to spring. The snow melted, but the fear persisted. The forest, which was once a playground for us, had become a forbidden and frightening place. We tried to resume our lives, but something had changed forever. We were always vigilant, waiting for the moment the pursuer would return. One afternoon, while walking through town, I felt a familiar presence. I looked around and saw a man standing on the corner, staring at me. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and hat, his face hidden in the shadows. My heart raced, and without thinking, I started to run. I didn't know where to go. I just wanted to get away as fast as possible. I arrived home breathless and told John what I had seen. He turned pale, and together we decided that we couldn't live in fear anymore. We needed to do something, find answers. We went back to the forest, this time more prepared and determined to discover the truth. As we approached the spot where we had found the bag, we felt the same nauseating smell as before. The body was there, exactly as we had left it. This time, we did something different. We took photos with our cell phones, documenting everything. We were determined to prove that we weren't crazy. Suddenly, we heard heavy footsteps again. Panic took over, but instead of running, we hid behind a nearby tree. We saw the shadowy figure approaching the bag, acting as if it was looking for something. The fear was almost palpable, but the adrenaline kept us still and silent. The figure rummaged through the bag, and it was then that we realized something even more terrifying. The body in the bag was not the same as before. This one seemed more recent, less decomposed. Whoever it was, they were replacing the bodies, perhaps in an attempt to confuse or scare us even more. When the figure finally left, we emerged from our hiding place and ran back home. We showed the photos to the police, and this time, they couldn't ignore us. They returned to the forest with us and found the body, but the shadowy figure had disappeared, leaving only the bag and its horrible contents. The investigation deepened, and it was discovered that several disappearances in the area could be linked to what we found. But the man in the forest was never captured. We continued to live our lives, but the fear never left us. The feeling of being watched, of always being on the brink of danger, became our new reality. Today, as I write this, I hear heavy footsteps outside my window. The feeling of being watched has returned with full force. John and I know that he never stopped looking for us. We live with the certainty that one day he will find us. And when that happens, there will be no escape. We've moved several times, always trying to escape the nightmare that follows us. But he always finds us. We no longer have permanent homes, only temporary places where we try for brief moments to feel a bit of security. Our nights are long and filled with vigilance. We don't sleep, we just wait. Our lives were forever marked by that day in the forest. The innocence we lost will never be recovered. We live in the shadow of fear, waiting for the moment when the shadowy figure will finally decide it's time to finish what he started. And we know that when that day comes, we will be alone, with no hope of salvation. Psychological terror is our constant companion, and the dread of being found consumes us daily. We are no longer the same people we once were. The joy of living is gone, replaced by an existence of constant alertness. We are prisoners of our own minds, captives of a past that won't leave us alone. And so, as I write these final words, I know he is out there, waiting. And we, defenseless, only await the moment when the nightmare will finally come to an end. Snow has always meant fun to me. My name is Josh. I'm 16 years old, and I've always loved snowy days when school was canceled, and we could spend the whole day playing. That winter morning, I woke up excited about the amount of snow that had fallen overnight. My dad had already left for work, and my mom was busy inside the house, so I decided to start shoveling the driveway. I grabbed the shovel and got to work, feeling the cold cut across my face but enjoying the physical activity. The snow was deep, but I was determined to clear it all by noon. While I was focused on the task, I heard a sound coming from the street. I looked up and saw a man approaching, limping slightly. He looked to be in his 30s, wearing a heavy coat and a beanie that covered part of his face. "Hey kid, can you help me?" he asked, his voice sounding friendly but with a touch of urgency. "Sure, sir. What happened?" I replied, stopping what I was doing and moving towards him. "I slipped and hurt my leg. My house is just around the corner. Could you help me get there?" "I need some ice and maybe to lie down for a bit," he said, pointing vaguely in the direction of the street. Something about the situation made me uncomfortable. It was a quiet neighborhood, and I had never seen this man before. But at the same time, he seemed genuinely in pain. "I can call my mom to help," I suggested, starting to turn towards the house. No, that's not necessary. I just need a hand to get there. It'll be quick, I promise," he insisted, trying to give a reassuring smile, but something in his eyes didn't seem right. "Sorry, but my mom always tells me not to talk to strangers. I'll call her and she can help you," I responded, feeling my self-preservation instinct kicking in. I started walking back to the house, but he took a step forward, trying to stop me. "Wait, kid, I really need help. It'll just take a minute," he said, his voice becoming a bit more insistent, almost desperate. My heart began to race, and a sense of panic started to rise. "No, I'm going to call my mom," I said firmly, and started running towards the door. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and called for my mom. "Mom, there's a man outside who needs help." She quickly came from the kitchen, drying her hands on her apron. "What happened, Josh?" I quickly explained what had happened, and she frowned, looking out the window. The man was still out there, looking in our direction. "Stay inside," she said, grabbing the phone and calling the police. While we waited, the man began to walk away, limping less than before. Something was definitely wrong. When the police arrived, my mom explained the situation and the officers started searching the area, but he was already gone. That night, while we were having dinner, my mom looked at me with a serious expression. "Josh, you did the right thing. You never know what someone might be planning." Days passed and the snow began to melt, but the memory of that stranger stayed with me. A few weeks later, we heard on the news that a man had been arrested in a nearby neighborhood for trying to lure children into his house with false claims of being injured. The description matched the man I had encountered. It was a relief to know he was caught, but also a chilling reminder of how things could have ended differently. Snow, which had always been synonymous with fun and freedom, now had a shadow of danger associated with it. I learned a valuable lesson that snowy day, a lesson about trusting my instincts and always prioritizing safety. And although snow returns every year, bringing the same excitement as always, I never look at a stranger the same way again. The world is a beautiful place, but it can also be scary, and being vigilant is the best way to stay safe. Life returned to normal, but whenever I see the snow fall, I remember that day and the stranger who tried to deceive me. I remember how something as innocent as a request for help can hide malicious intentions. And above all, I remember how important it is to listen to the warnings and advice of those who care about us. As I grew up, my parents continued to teach me about safety and caution, not in a paranoid way, but realistically. Today, as an adult, I pass these lessons on to my children, ensuring they know how important it is to be alert and protect one another. Snow still falls every winter, covering the landscape with its white blanket and bringing that same excitement as always. But now, when I see the snow, I also see a reminder of a moment that could have ended tragically, but fortunately became a valuable life lesson. And that's how a simple snowy day became a memory that shaped my behavior and perceptions, transforming me from an innocent teenager into a cautious adult, always aware of the dangers that can lurk even in the most peaceful and ordinary moments. I've always been skeptical about the supernatural. I never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything of the sort. To me, everything always had a logical and rational explanation. But on that winter night, my worldview was shaken in a way I never imagined possible. It was a night of a snowstorm, one of those nights where the snowflakes fall thickly and the wind howls through the window cracks. I was alone in my country house, an old building I bought a few years ago to escape the stress of the city. I enjoyed the isolation and tranquility the surrounding forest offered. I was sitting in the living room reading a book when I heard the first sound, a dull thud against the window, as if something had been thrown at it. I got up, curious, and looked out the window. Nothing but darkness and falling snow. I sat back down, thinking it might just be a branch broken by the wind. A few minutes later, another thud, and then another, and another. I went to the front door and stepped outside to check. The cold was biting, and the snow was already accumulating in a thick layer on the ground. I looked around, searching for any sign of someone, but saw nothing, just the silence of the night and the distant sound of the wind. I went back inside, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. With each thud, my heart raced a little more. I decided to occupy myself with something else, turned on the TV, and tried to distract myself. But the thuds continued, increasingly insistent. I decided I needed to find out where they were coming from. I put on a thick coat, boots, and went outside again. I walked around the house, examining each window. And then I saw it, footprints in the snow, small, as if they were from a child. The footprints went from the living room window to the back of the house and disappeared into the forest. My heart froze more than the winter itself when I realized those marks were fresh, made recently. I followed the footprints, lighting the way with a flashlight. The snowstorm made it difficult to see far, but I kept going. The footprints led to a small memorial I had never noticed before, hidden among the trees. It was a simple wooden cross with frozen flowers and a plaque that read, "In memory of Sarah and Michael, mother and son, tragically deceased in an accident." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know who Sarah and Michael were, but the memorial suggested something tragic had happened there. I looked around, searching for any explanation, but there was only the silently falling snow. Suddenly, I felt like I was being watched, a presence, something invisible, but undeniably real. I went back to the house, feeling more disturbed than ever. The thuds on the window continued all night, and I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the dull, repetitive sound, trying to understand what was happening. My mind was racing, and with each thud, the feeling of being watched intensified. The next day, I went to town and asked the locals about the memorial. I learned that Sarah and Michael were a mother and son who died in a car accident many years ago, during a snowstorm like the one I was experiencing. Their car skidded on the icy road and fell into a ravine, killing them both instantly. Since then, there were rumors that their souls still wandered the forest, trapped in that tragic moment. I returned home with the weight of this story on my mind. The thuds continued the following nights, and the footprints in the snow always led to the memorial. I began to feel a deep sadness, as if I were sharing the grief of those spirits. Each thud on the window felt like a cry of despair, a plea for help that I didn't know how to answer. Over time, I began to talk to them, even without knowing if they could hear me. I told them about my day, about my own fears and sorrows, and strangely, the thuds diminished. They still occurred, but less frequently and intensely. I felt that, somehow, I was offering a bit of comfort to those tormented spirits. However, one night, the thuds stopped completely. Instead of relief, I felt a huge emptiness. I went to the memorial, now covered by a new layer of snow, and left fresh flowers. I stayed there for a while in silence, feeling an indescribable connection to Sarah and Michael. I returned to the house, hoping that peace had finally come to them. But it wasn't the end. That night, I woke up to a different sound. It wasn't thuds on the window, but whispers. Soft, indistinct voices, as if someone were trying to speak to me. I got up, followed the sound, and found the living room window open with snow blowing in. I closed the window, and when I turned around, saw two figures in the darkened room. A woman and a child, both with sad, pleading looks. My heart stopped, and reality distorted around me. They weren't at peace. They were trapped, seeking someone who could free them. I spent the following days researching how to help spirits find rest. I tried various rituals and prayers, but nothing seemed to work. The figures continued to appear, more frequently, and the whispers grew louder and more desperate. I started to lose my sanity. The nights were a torment, and the days a constant wait for the next encounter. My life turned into an endless nightmare. Each attempt to help seemed only to make things worse, as if I were picking at a deep, bloody wound. Finally, one night of total despair, I decided to confront them directly. I went to the memorial, alone, and called out to Sarah and Michael, asking them to show me what needed to be done to free them. The snow fell intensely, and the wind seemed to carry my words away. Then, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned and saw Sarah, with frozen tears on her face. Michael was beside her, holding her hand. They didn't need to speak. Somehow, I understood what needed to be done. I returned to the house, grabbed my car, and drove to the site of the accident. The road was covered in ice, and every curve felt like a mortal challenge. Finally, I arrived at the ravine where their car had fallen. I looked down and saw the wreckage of the vehicle, buried in the snow. I descended carefully, feeling the danger with each step. When I reached the car, I realized there was something stuck inside. It was a photo, a memento of Sarah and Michael, which had been forgotten all these years. I took the photo and, with tears in my eyes, whispered a prayer. When I returned to the memorial, I placed the photo among the flowers. I felt an inexplicable peace. Sarah and Michael's figures appeared one last time, with sad but grateful smiles. They disappeared into the gentle light of the snow, and I knew they were finally at peace. Today, the thuds on the window have ceased, and the whispers have vanished. But the memory of that experience will never leave me. I still feel their presence sometimes, a silent reminder that love and tragedy are intertwined in ways we will never fully understand. My life has returned to normal, but I am a different person now. Skepticism has given way to a deeper understanding of the inexplicable. And every time it snows, I look at the forest and remember Sarah and Michael, hoping that wherever they are, they have finally found the peace they sought. Working in a department store can be tiring, but I've always enjoyed the constant activity and interactions with customers. My name is Sarah, I'm 25, and I work in the women's clothing section of a large department store downtown. It was a cold Wednesday in winter, with a heavy snowstorm covering the streets in white. The city was almost paralyzed, but the store was still open, receiving the few customers who braved the weather to shop. That morning, while reorganizing some items on the shelves, I noticed a strange man standing near the counter. He seemed to be in his early 30s, wearing a heavy coat and a beanie that covered part of his face. There was something unsettling about his presence, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Can I help you with something, sir?" I asked, trying to sound professional and friendly. "No, just looking," he replied. But his eyes never left mine. The intensity of his gaze made me uncomfortable, so I decided to walk away. As the day went on, I noticed that the man continued to watch me. He wandered around the store, seemingly without purpose, but always positioning himself to keep me in his line of sight. I began to feel a growing sense of fear. Every time I saw him, his stare seemed to become more intense, almost predatory. I talked to my colleague, Lisa, about my concerns. "I think that man is following me," I whispered, trying not to attract attention. Lisa discreetly looked over at him and frowned. "I'll talk to security. Stay close to me," she said. The day dragged on and the snowstorm outside intensified, making the store even emptier and quieter. The man kept following me, more blatantly now. He asked trivial questions about the clothes, but always with that cold gaze that seemed to strip me to my core. By the end of my shift, I was terrified. I knew he was still there, waiting for something. I asked one of the security guards, John, to walk me to my car. John was a big, reliable man, always vigilant for any trouble in the store. "Sarah, I'll walk you to your car. Don't worry," he said, trying to reassure me. While we waited in the locker room, Lisa and some other colleagues gathered around me, offering support. When we finally went out, the parking lot was almost empty, lit only by the dim street lights. The cold wind howled, carrying snowflakes that stung the skin like needles. John was by my side, his reassuring presence giving me a bit of courage. Lisa and other colleagues also decided to join us, forming a small escort. As we approached my car, I saw the strange man standing near one of the streetlights, watching our every move. "There he is," I whispered, my voice trembling. John put a hand on my shoulder. "Stay calm. We won't let anything happen to you." We reached my car, and John looked directly at the man, his gaze hard and challenging. "Can I help you with something?" he asked firmly. The man didn't respond, just gave a creepy smile and slowly walked away, disappearing into the darkness and snow. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still felt a knot of fear in my stomach. I quickly got into the car, locking the doors as soon as John closed the passenger door. "Thank you, John. Seriously, I don't know what I would have done without you," I said, my voice still shaking. "Don't worry, Sarah. You're safe now," he replied, giving me a reassuring smile. My colleagues said goodbye and went back to the store, leaving me alone with John. He insisted on accompanying me to the parking lot exit, making sure no one was following us. Finally, after a few tense minutes, he waved goodbye, and I drove home, still feeling the impact of what had happened. When I got home, I told my mom about the incident, who was horrified and suggested I file a police report. I followed her advice and went to the police station the next day, where I described the man and what had happened. The officers promised to investigate, but couldn't guarantee he wouldn't come back. The following days were filled with anxiety. The store seemed different, less safe. I began to constantly look over my shoulder, always alert to any sign of danger. The man didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never left me. A few weeks later, I received a call from the police. They had identified the man through security cameras, and he had a history of disturbing behavior. He was arrested for harassment in another store and was in custody. The news brought some relief, but the psychological impact of the incident continued to haunt me. Returning to work was never the same. The department store, once a place of interaction and routine, was now a place where the threat seemed to always lurk. My colleagues and I became closer, more vigilant, but the shadow of fear hung over us. I learned to be more careful and trust my instincts. That experience taught me the importance of speaking up and asking for help when something feels wrong. Life went on, but the memory of the strange man in the department store remains a constant reminder of the dangers that can hide in plain sight. Even today, when I see a customer who seems a bit off, I get a shiver and remember that disturbing smile. I work with more caution, always ready to react, and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Because in a world where danger can be lurking anywhere, being prepared is the best defense we can have. Blizzards always gave me a sense of peace. The snow falling gently, covering everything with a white blanket, seemed to erase worries and bring a silent calm. But that night, during one of those blizzards, that feeling was replaced by an indescribable terror that still haunts me. It was a Friday night, and I was driving home after a long day at work. The snow was falling heavily, and the streets were practically deserted. The street lights dimly lit the way, casting dancing shadows on the road. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a car following closely behind. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just a neighbor or someone trying to navigate the blizzard. But as I continued driving, I realized the car kept the same distance, no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. My heart began to race, and a cold sweat ran down my neck. The road to my house is long and winding, surrounded by tall, dense trees. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that it was just a coincidence. But every time I looked in the rearview mirror, there was the car, its headlights piercing the darkness like watchful eyes. Finally, I reached my street and turned into my driveway. The car was still following me, and a sense of panic took over. I quickly parked and ran inside, locking the door behind me. I looked out the window and saw the car stopped at the end of the driveway. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there as if he was waiting. My mind was racing. Who could it be? What did he want? I thought about calling the police, but wasn't sure if there was enough reason to do so. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, the car reversed and drove away. The relief I felt was momentary, quickly replaced by a growing unease. I decided to check the security cameras I had installed around the house. I reviewed the footage and saw the car stopped at the driveway, just as I had seen. But something else caught my attention. Footprints in the snow, leading from the driveway to the window of my bedroom on the second floor. My blood ran cold. Someone had gotten out of the car and walked through the snow, stopping right in front of my bedroom window. The footprints were clear, pressed deeply into the fresh snow. I ran upstairs, heart pounding, and looked out the window. Nothing, just darkness and gently falling snow. I stayed up all night, my mind tormented by the possibilities. Who was that person? What did he want with me? And more importantly, why was he watching me? The next day, I went out to the driveway to examine the footprints up close. They were large, made by heavy boots, probably a man's. I followed the tracks to the bedroom window and then back to the driveway where they disappeared. In the following days, my paranoia only grew. I started noticing small signs that someone was watching me, a feeling of being observed, shadows in places where there shouldn't be any, and strange noises at night. I told a few friends, but they all said I was overreacting, that it was just work stress and the loneliness exacerbated by the blizzard. But I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Something was wrong. One night, while trying to distract myself by watching TV, I heard the sound of footsteps outside. I went to the window, but saw nothing but falling snow and absolute silence. I grabbed a baseball bat and went outside to check. The footprints were back, leading from the driveway to the bedroom window. This time, I followed them more determinedly, trying to find any clue as to who it could be. The footprints disappeared into the main road, covered by the still falling snow. I went back inside, feeling more powerless than ever. In an attempt to regain some control, I installed more cameras and sensors around the house. Every movement was recorded, every sound amplified. But the nights were endless, and the feeling of being watched never subsided. One night, I woke up to a loud noise coming from the basement. I grabbed the bat and went down cautiously. The basement was empty, but the window was open. Someone had been inside. Fear gripped me, and I called the police. They arrived quickly but found no one. They said it could have been a common burglar, but I knew it was more than that. The feeling of being hunted, of having someone always one step ahead, was unbearable. The following days were a blur of fear and anxiety. Every night was a battle against my own sanity. The footprints continued to appear, always leading to the bedroom window. It seemed like the stalker was enjoying himself, playing with my fear. I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. One night I waited for the car to return. When it did, I hid near the garage, ready to confront the intruder. The car stopped, and a man got out. He was wearing a dark coat and hood, his face hidden. He walked to the bedroom window, just like before. I emerged from my hiding place, bat in hand, and shouted for him to get away. He turned slowly, and I saw his face for the first time. He was a middle-aged man with empty eyes and a disturbing smile. He said something I couldn't understand and started walking towards me. Adrenaline took over, and I charged at him with the bat. He dodged easily, and before I could react, I felt a sharp blow to my head. I woke up hours later, lying in the snow, my head throbbing. The car was gone, and the footprints were covered by a new layer of snow. I went inside, feeling a mix of rage and fear. The police came again, but found nothing. They suggested I consider moving, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. The stalker knew where I lived, and nothing would stop him from finding me again. I spent the following days trying to reinforce security, but the fear was always present. On a particularly cold night, I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I ran to the bedroom and saw the window shattered. Cold wind was blowing in, and the curtains were flapping wildly. I looked outside and saw the footprints leading to the garage. I grabbed the bat and went down, ready to face the intruder once more. But this time he wasn't alone. Several figures were scattered in the snow, all looking at me. They were like shadows, indistinct and threatening. Terror took hold of me, and I started backing away slowly. One of them came closer, and I saw it was the man from the car, with the same disturbing smile. I ran back inside, locking all the doors and windows. I picked up the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. The fear was overwhelming, and I didn't know what to do. The figures outside were moving closer, surrounding the house. Finally, not knowing what else to do, I wrote this story, hoping someone reads it and understands what happened to me. I know my life is in danger, and I don't know how much time I have left. But if you're reading this, know that the fear is real, and that he's out there, waiting for me. And maybe soon, he'll come for you too. I have always been a lover of nature and the mountains. My name is David, and I decided I needed a break from the hustle and bustle of the city and the pressures of work. I rented an isolated cabin in the Colorado mountains, hoping to find some peace and tranquility. I arrived on a winter day, with snow beginning to fall lightly, covering the landscape with a white blanket. The cabin was cozy, with a stone fireplace and large windows offering a magnificent view of the snow-covered mountains. I was excited to spend a few days reading, hiking, and simply enjoying the solitude. However, the tranquility soon turned into something much darker. On the second night, the snowstorm intensified. The wind howled outside, and the snow fell in torrents, creating an almost impenetrable barrier around the cabin. I was sitting near the fireplace reading a book when I heard loud knocks on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could be out there in such a storm? I cautiously got up and opened the door. Two strangers were outside, covered in snow and shivering from the cold. "Please help us. Our car broke down on the road and we're lost," said one of them, a woman with a desperate look on her face. The man beside her looked equally distressed. "Can we shelter here until the storm passes?" he asked. Despite the uneasy feeling that washed over me, I couldn't help but feel compassion for them. The storm was terrible, and leaving them out there would be cruel. "Sure, come in," I said, making room for them to enter. They introduced themselves as Laura and Tom. Laura had dark, piercing eyes, while Tom seemed nervous, his eyes constantly scanning the room. I made some hot tea and offered them blankets to warm up. I tried to be a good host, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They were overly interested in my stay, asking questions about how long I would be there, and if anyone else knew I was there. As the night went on, the feeling of unease grew. Laura and Tom seemed to exchange conspiratorial glances, and I began to wonder if their intentions were truly innocent. I decided I needed to stay alert. I locked my bedroom door and kept my cell phone close, though the signal was weak in that remote area. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a strange sound coming from the living room. I quietly left my room and heard whispers. I approached slowly, trying not to make a noise. When I got close to the living room, I saw Laura and Tom rummaging through my things, as if they were looking for something. "Where could he have hidden it?" I heard Laura whisper. "It must be around here somewhere. We need to find it before he wakes up," Tom replied. My heart raced. They were looking for something, but what? I silently returned to my room, trying not to panic. I needed to get out of there, but the storm was still raging. However, staying there with those two seemed even more dangerous. I decided to act. I quietly put on my coat and boots, trying not to make a sound. I opened the bedroom window and slowly climbed out. The wind and snow were relentless, but adrenaline gave me strength. I knew I needed to find help and alert the authorities about Laura and Tom. I walked through the thick snow, my footprints quickly covered by the storm. It was completely dark, and the only light came from the increasingly distant cabin. With each step, my mind imagined the worst, but I kept going, knowing it was my only chance to survive. After walking for hours that felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light in the distance. It was another cabin. With my last bit of strength, I knocked on the door desperately. An elderly man opened the door, surprised to see me there. "Please help me. There are dangerous people in my cabin," I pleaded, feeling my strength fading. He pulled me inside, closing the door against the biting cold. "Stay calm. You're safe now," he said, offering me a blanket. I quickly explained the situation, and he immediately called the police, though the connection was unstable. "They're on their way, but it will take some time because of the storm," he said. The wait was agonizing. Every minute felt like an eternity, and my mind was filled with terrible images of what Laura and Tom might be doing. Finally, after several hours, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police had arrived. They took me back to my cabin, where Laura and Tom were still there, apparently getting ready to leave. When they saw the police, they tried to flee, but were quickly apprehended. The officers found several weapons and tools in their backpacks, confirming my suspicions that their intentions were far from innocent. Later, I found out that Laura and Tom were wanted criminals known for breaking into isolated homes during storms, taking advantage of people's vulnerability. I was saved by a hair's breadth, and the experience left a deep mark on me. I never went back to that cabin. The nature I loved so much had become a nightmare setting. Now, whenever I see a snowstorm start, I remember that terrifying night, and am grateful to have escaped with my life. The peace and tranquility I sought in the mountains were replaced by a constant awareness of the dangers that can lurk in the shadows of nature and human malice. Now, when I look at the falling snow, I feel a chill that doesn't come just from the cold. It's a grim reminder that the real threat may be much closer than we imagine, hidden behind friendly smiles and seemingly innocent pleas for help.